Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, depending where you guys are. But welcome to another edition of Jakarta Tech Talks. Today we have Josh Juno showing us utilizing JSF front ends with microservices. So without further ado, Josh, take it away.
Thanks. I appreciate you having me. Hello to everybody. I hope everybody is staying healthy and safe in these crazy times. And I appreciate you taking the time out to learn a little bit about using JSF with microservices. Basically, if you are familiar with using JSF in the past on other projects such as, single application WAR files and utilizing along with EJB, this works very similarly. And so what I wanted to do is just kind of show a little bit about how you can utilize JSF to create a stateless application that utilizes microservices very well. And also show a little bit about how that code works along with JAX-RS. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to toggle my video off and start sharing my screen. Okay, so right now, hopefully you are seeing my slides. I'm going to go ahead and start playing the deck. And so this presentation is basically called utilizing JSF front ends with microservices. And as I mentioned, my name is Josh Juno. I'm an A-Press and Java Magazine author. I'm a member of the JCP, Apache NetBeans contributor and committer. I'm a member of the Jakarta EE ambassadors and Java champions. So during my day job, what I do is application developer, primarily Java and Java EE, Jakarta EE. I also act as a DBA, primarily working with Oracle databases, but I do work with some FileMaker databases. And also system administrator. I'm always working with servers, both Linux and Windows-based primarily. And, when I'm not at work, during the day, I am authoring and speaking and doing podcasts with several others. As I mentioned, I'm a Java champion, Apache NetBeans developer. I primarily develop the Java EE code that helps make Apache NetBeans move forward with Java EE support. So really the Java EE8 support, and soon will be Jakarta EE8 support in Apache NetBeans as well. And like I had mentioned, also a member of the Jakarta EE ambassadors. So today we're going to be showing just a primer of some of the features that are newer to Jakarta Server Faces and also Jakarta RESTful web services. Also going to be showing just how to basically create a simple service utilizing Jakarta EE specs, which will provide data, calls into a database, and will allow one to query and also add and edit and remove data. Going to use Jakarta Server Faces to develop a front end to display and update data, and we'll be using REST calls to make this happen along with the database so that everything is stateless. And then we're going to be showing how to just incorporate some JSF frameworks to build a robust front end. Now, I just want to start off and let you know this is something that I do. I'm developing applications using JSF still. Today, it's very viable technology for using as front ends on microservices and other, regular standard applications as well. Some people call them monolith applications. I really do enjoy them still. They do definitely have a space in the ecosystem. Doesn't really make sense to use microservices in some cases. So, JSF is just my go-to front end technology because it's so easy to use and it provides so much right out of the box. I'm going to show you a little bit about that today. So, giving you an idea of how to get started, if you wanted to download code and start going, I will share this code after the presentation. So if you wanted to go on GitHub and obtain the sources and get started, what you'll need to do is download Eclipse Glassfish 5.1.0 or utilize Pyra 5.194 plus for JDK 11 support there. I'm not sure the Eclipse Glassfish yet provides JDK 11 support, but I could be wrong about that. Now, for this particular presentation, I'll be using Pyra 5.19, or excuse me, 5.291, I believe, with JDK 11. You'll just need to include Jakarta EE8 dependencies in your project. I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to be using Maven. So that's my build system, and I'll be pulling the dependencies in using a POM file. There are lots of great examples out there, so this is just a link to a couple of them. So just to give you a quick overview with Jakarta EE8, this release is primarily the first release of Java EE in an open source atmosphere. So, Java EE was transferred to the Eclipse Foundation, and it is now known as Jakarta EE, and Jakarta EE8 is the first release. And it really just provides the same functionality as Java EE8 did provide. And what that is continued enhancements for productivity and web standards alignment. And it does have better alignment with Java SE8. But as I mentioned, you can also utilize Java 11 as well if you're using the compatible application server. And this also works towards a better platform for development of microservices. Now, I just want to take another step back real quick and mention that what I'm going to show you today also works very well with Docker and containerized environments. So actually, the project that I'm using today deploys very well to Pyra Micro. And so that will allow you to deploy your service to a container and put it, in Docker, and then you'll have your Docker container, which will be providing you data for a separate container, which will include your front end. So you basically have separate services. The one service is going to contain your JSF front end, and then your other services will communicate with your front end service to make the overall application work. So a little bit about JSF 2.3. It does have there's WebSocket integration, AJAX method invocation, class level validation, works very well with Java 8 date time. There are also some UI changes such as iterable map custom UI data support. There are some component search expressions now. The radio button was made part of the library. They added style class attribute on H column, so that allows you to better style your data tables. And then there's basic support for extensionless URLs. So just to kind of show you real quickly, one of the great new features of JSF 2.3 was the ability to provide, date time support. So now, instead of using regular Java date, you could use local date or local date time. And that's all supplied via the use of this convert date time converter, which now accepts a type of local date to go ahead and apply that to your dates. And then the back end, of course, in your entity class or your CDI bean, you would have fields that are of type local date, local time, etc. Other things that were part of JSF 3.0, lots of removal of old cruft. So managed beans are not really used any longer. Now we utilize CDI beans. This is basically providing you with the great feature that CDI allows is it provides you the ability to utilize scope in your application and pull beans in to other resources so that they can be used, and it provides you with many different scopes which can be used application wide. So the managed beans facility was basically created just for JSF, and we are no longer really using that today. It's all should be CDI based. And more artifacts are moving towards CDI. So that means that we can now go ahead and do injection into our beans as well with some of the JSF artifacts. There's an action model that's possibly going to be coming at some point, and extensionless mapping. So as I had mentioned, we can inject some JSF artifacts using JSF 2.3, such as external context and the servlet context. In the past, we used to have to use a couple of lines of code in order to make these, to gain access to these resources, but now we can just inject them with CDI. So that works by JSF 2.3 providing default producers for many of the most commonly used JSF artifacts. And then another benefit is we can now, when you're building a custom converter or validator, these are now injection targets as well. So you can inject into those as well. So here's just a quick screenshot of some of the different artifacts that can be injected into your CDI beans. So let's take a look at another one of the specs that I'm going to show you a little bit about today, and that's Jakarta API for RESTful Web Services, or JAX-RS, as it's commonly been known. Some of the new features were improved CDI integration, reactive client API, non-blocking I/O. These were some of the newer features that were released as part of Java EE 8, so therefore they're part of Jakarta EE 8. Server-sent events are part of this spec now, and they include the ability to create a one-way communication channel. Basically, will allow you to blast messages from the server to many different clients. And so what we want to do here in order to create an application which allows JSF to be used as the front end for microservices, let's first start by building a simple service. So this service will basically utilize JAX-RS or Jakarta RESTful Web Services. It uses JPA to communicate with the database, and bean validation to limit, the string length and whatnot for data that can be entered into that entity class. And then with this solution, we're going to be utilizing JSF for a front end. I'll show you how to do that, which basically we're going to be using model classes, which are very much like entity classes, but it's just basically a POJO, plain old Java object that is going to be used to store that data, which is going to be retrieved using JAX-RS. We're going to use facelets for the view, and CDI beans, of course, for the business logic and the controllers. We're going to wire all this together using expression language. And like I said, the front end is going to communicate with the services using JAX-RS. And all the database communication is going to occur within the services. So that means the front end doesn't have to know, anything about the database. All it cares about is the RESTful endpoints, the web services that it is going to be using to communicate. The JAX-RS web service will then make a call to the database using JPA and then send that data back in an XML or JSON format so that the JSF front end can pick it up. So on the front end, when we're using the JSF, we're going to have to utilize a JAX-RS client. And this code here kind of shows you just how to set something like this up using straight code. There are APIs now which will allow you to get rid of some of the ceremony, so you do not have to write all this code out to create a JAX-RS client. So one such implementation is the microprofile RESTful web services client, which allows you to use an annotation instead. But in this case, what I'll be doing is basically showing you how to do all the code. And so you would create the client based upon a URI to a RESTful web service, and then you would just make a call by calling upon the request and passing the media type of XML, since we want to retrieve XML. And then in this case, we're going to be retrieving a list of entity classes which go by the name of roster. So that's why you see we are retrieving a list of roster. And then when I'm making a call using that client code, the RESTful web service may look something like this. So in this case, we're going to be producing or returning XML or JSON, and this is a GET call. So whenever that RESTful web service is invoked without putting an extension or a path on the end of it, it's going to go ahead and call this method, which will return a list of the roster entities. So let me get out of this presentation here and show you a little bit about how this is done. So I'm going into Apache NetBeans here, and I'm going to show you the web service code. So this code is called roster service. And basically, to start off, what we have here is a class, which is an entity class, and it's going to be called roster. What this does, this entity class basically maps to a database table, okay? So let me show you very quickly. I've got this database that is running locally on my laptop here, and it is an Apache Derby database, okay? And so what I have here are a couple of tables. One of those is called roster, okay? And there are 5 fields in roster. And so basically what this entity class does, if you're not familiar with Java Persistence or Jakarta Persistence API, is it will map this POJO, this plain old Java object, to this roster class. So basically I create this entity class. The table behind it is going to be called roster. And I'm going to have column for each of the fields in the database table. So you can see here that what I'm doing is I've got this sequence generator for the primary key, which is the ID. What this is going to do is every time a new entity is created, the sequence will be incremented. And so the primary key will automatically increment, and we will always have a primary or a unique key here in this scenario. So basically to make this happen, what I did in Apache Derby was create a sequence by the name of roster_s. Okay, and the rest of it is just the same as a regular plain old Java object. Okay, so that we will need in order to map to our database. And then the other thing we need to set up this RESTful web service is a JAX-RS configuration. And so basically all that comes down to is annotating a class that extends the javax.ws.rs.application, .core application, excuse me. So if we extend that application class and then we annotate with application path, this is the URI which is going to make our RESTful endpoints available to our client. So the next thing I want to do is create a web service class that is going to utilize this entity class. This is pretty easy to do if you're using something like Apache NetBeans. So what I would do here in this case would be right-click, and I would just say that I wanted to create a new RESTful web services for entity classes. And this would allow me to select the roster class that I just created, and it would create this code here. Basically what this does is creates a EJB almost, but it's a RESTful web service EJB. So it's going to annotate the class with this path, which allows the web service to become available on using roster in the URI. And we have a persistence context in this class because this is actually going to be utilized to communicate with the database. So we've got this entity manager here that is injected in with the persistence context. And basically what it is going to do is it'll be used to communicate with the database. So since I used NetBeans to automatically generate this, most of the entity manager is abstracted away using this abstract facade. So we won't worry about it. But just know that when I'm in this class, if you look at the create method, for instance, if I call upon create entity, that's automatically calling upon the entity manager and persisting this this entity into the database. So lots of that code is taken away, so you don't have to worry about it. So in this case, what we want to look at first is the method I had showed you in the slide, which is find all. Because if I call this RESTful web service without providing a path, and I just end it with roster, it's going to call upon this method, which will find all of the roster records. So this is what happens when I call upon it. So I put in the URL into my browser and call upon roster. And it's going to return me all of the records that are in my roster database, okay? And so that's all the find all method does. So what we want to do here is get this information into a table, okay? A database table, or excuse me, a table in a JSF application that will basically show the data that's in the table. So let's go ahead now and we'll look at the JSF front end project. Let me minimize this. And so I've got another project called Roster UI. Okay, so let's assume that this service is on some Docker container. Okay, it's running in its own Docker container. So I can put this Roster UI service in its own container as well. In this case, I'm running both of them on a local Pi or a server, but they could be in their own container if you wanted. And so what I have here, I'm going to first show you how to create this communication using just straight JSF. I'm not going to be bringing in any special libraries here for this. So what I want to do is basically get to the final result of this. So if you can see my screen here, basically what I am showing you is a database representation on screen. Okay, so I'm querying that RESTful web service, and I'm presenting the data now into a table in JSF. So the way I did that here is in my index page, I just go ahead and I've got this data table created. This data table, what it does is it calls upon the value of this roster list. And that roster list is contained within roster controller, okay? So what is roster controller? So roster controller is our CDI bean, okay? So since this is a JSF application, we use CDI to go ahead and communicate and use business logic. So what the CDI bean will do is communicate with our RESTful web service and provide the data. So being that it is CDI, I can use this named annotation to make this controller available to my front end via the expression language. Remember, I said that we were going to wire this together using expression language. So when I looked at my view, I can call straight upon roster controller since it's got the named injection. This is also view scoped. So this isn't the old JSF view scoped. This is the CDI view scoped. So if we look here, you can see I'm injecting Java X Faces view scoped. And so that means that this bean is only going to maintain state for the lifetime of the view. So once you navigate to a different view, the state is lost, okay? So to do that, I have to make this serializable, serializable, so this controller can be serialized and persist at the disk if needed. And what I do here is I call upon this post construct method when this view is visited, because this bean is going to be instantiated every time the view is visited, and post construct will also then be called automatically. What am I doing with post construct? Well, I'm populating that roster list. Okay, so like I said, roster list is just a list of the roster objects. And I think I did step a little too fast here because I didn't show you what roster looks like. So as I showed you, remember, if you recall on the service, I've got the entity class of roster, and I have a very similar class here in my JSF front end. And this is just basically a plain old Java object. And I also include this XML root element annotation, which allows this to translate to XML so that it can be transported back and forth, okay? It's also then a serializable class, and I include a field for each of the database fields or entity class fields. I can also use bean validation to limit the size or control, constrain the fields as I need to do in my application. And then you can see it's just basically a, uses accessor methods. There's a hash code equals toString. To give you a quick tip, if you want to use Lombok, that library will allow you to get rid of all of these accessor methods, all the getters and setters. You can get rid of every one of them. You can get rid of these equals and hash code methods and toString as well. And basically all you'll have left is this. It looks a lot like a Groovy class in that case if you use Lombok. But here we're doing straight Java. So basically all my model class is a POJO, and it's annotated with XML root element. Okay, so back within my view scoped controller, I've got a list of these roster objects, and I need to populate that using the RESTful web service. So how do I do that? So I use that JAX-RS client, okay? What I did here is I showed you a little tip. If you're going to be calling upon the RESTful web service client often, it makes sense to abstract to that to call away into some utility class. So I created this utility class here that it holds a bunch of, widely used common utilities. And this method here is called a tame client. What it does is it accepts a client URI and a client service name. And it builds this client. It goes ahead and obtains it and returns the resource, the web target. Okay, so in this particular class here, I've got this constant set up. The constant is set up to go to my web service, okay? And you'll notice that there is no underlying web service at the end of it. All I've got is this path to the RESTful application endpoint, okay? so what it does is this will get you to the point where it's available. This is your application with the service, but I didn't actually put a service name at the end. So roster is not there. So that allows me to use this URI for any services that I create within roster service. So if I also wanted to have another service in there, maybe called team service or something, then I could utilize this RESTful URI for any of those services. And right here is where I pass roster, the actual endpoint URI. So when that client is built, it calls upon target client URI dot path, and then it's taking the client service, and it's going to return that web target. Okay, so then what I do is I'm just printing the target out to the command line so I can see the URI. And what I do is I set the roster list here. So how I do that is I call upon the request. I'm requesting this XML, and I have to wrap it into this generic type, and I'm returning a list of roster. Okay, so that's actually how it's done. And once I then view that page, as you can see, let me type it in here just so you can see the whole. There you go. And I'm just getting all of the records in that table, okay? So that's not very interesting. I'm getting the data. So what about adding data? Well, that's easy enough too. I can add data using a web service as well. So let's just add a new record of test. Well, first name is test, test2 for the last name, and we'll make this person a forward. And I can add, and as you see, that's been now added to my table. So how does that happen? So if we look at our code here, basically what I've got is this add player button that is at the bottom of the page. And the action that is called upon is add, okay? What that means is it's going to return this add, okay? Since I'm not really calling upon an action in the CDI bean, I'm just returning a string. That's going to use that implicit navigation to call a view that is named add. So when I pull up the add view, basically what you can see is it's just a form. And the way I created it, I utilize a panel grid to provide labels and input fields. And then I map these fields to a current variable that is within the roster controller, okay? So if we take a look at current, what is current? Current is just a roster object, okay? And so when I call upon that object, it's calling get current. And if current is null, it's going to create a new roster object. So when I call that add and I show it, it automatically creates a new roster object, right? And then I populate that on the screen. And then I go ahead and select this add player action, okay? This does now is perform another RESTful call to add that player to the database. So the way that works is that I'm, of course, obtaining this client again using that shortcut I showed you about. But this time, I'm not only getting roster, I'm getting add, okay? So this is going to call the add service. So let's go ahead and take a look real quick on the web service again. And I'm going to show you what add actually contains. So if I look at the web service code here, you can see that the path annotation of add is added to this method that's named add, okay? And this accepts a couple of form parameters, okay? So we are accepting a form parameter of first name, last name, and position. And basically what this is going to do is create a new roster object. It's going to set the date, and it's going to go ahead and populate this roster object accordingly. And then it's going to utilize that entity manager I showed you to create this roster object. And then it's just going to return a response to the client to let it know if it was successful or not. So if I go back to my code now for add player, you can see here in my CDI bean in the front end, what I am doing is I'm creating this form object. And what type of a form is that? It is a Java JAX-RS core form object. And I'm going to set it up passing parameters. So I named the first parameter first name, second parameter last name, third parameter position. And I'm just basically pulling out the different fields from this roster object I populated on the screen. Okay, and then what I'm doing here is I'm getting this invocation builder, and I'm setting the request type to XML, and then I post the entity, and what I'm posting is this form object, and I'm going to set it the media type accordingly, and I'm going to be looking for a response from the web service call. And if the response is okay, or the status code is okay, it's going to go ahead and add that player to the database, okay? If it's not, then it's supposed to return a message that says, hey, that didn't work. Okay, so like I showed you before, in the front end here, I added that player, okay? And we can do the same thing with remove. So I want to remove that player, so I click that button, and basically that should have removed the player. You see, it's if I refresh the screen, it's removed. For some reason, my Ajax isn't working correctly on this remove button. I didn't take the time to figure that one out, but I'll show you how it works. So basically, I've got this remove action as well here. And what I do is in the column itself here, as you can see in the data table, I'm iterating over each of the entities in the roster list using this player variable, okay? So when I'm listing the first name and the position and whatnot, I'm showing, you know, player.position, player.enter date, player.first name. So that allows me to get down to the field level of each of these, you know, entities in the list. So I can actually pass that entity to the remove method as well. And when I do that, I'm saying, okay, I want to remove this player. Okay, so the way that that happens is very similarly. I'm doing a different kind of call this time just to show you a different way to do it. There are various different ways to you know, work with the RESTful web service. You could use a form object like I showed you with the add. You can also utilize some of the methods that are inherently there by default. So in this case, that's what I'm doing. I'm passing this the ID of this roster player, and then I'm going to call upon the request.delete method. What that's going to do is in the RESTful web server to call upon this delete method, the method in the class that is annotated by @delete. And as you can see, that method accepts an ID, and then it just goes ahead and uses that entity manager to remove that object, okay? So that's basically all it does. So the front end then, by clicking remove, is able to remove that player, and then you can see what it does is it just sets the roster list to null and populate the roster list so that next time you query that list, it is available and it is showing the true list with the removed player. Now, my code here is supposed to use this FAJAX event to clear and to refresh that list, but it's not working for some reason. That's okay though, because I created a nicer front end. That's showing you how to do just straight JSF. And that's all nice and well and good. Most of our applications nowadays, we want to utilize a more crisp front end, which provides you much more robust actions and capabilities so that the users have a better experience. So one of the libraries that I like to utilize is called PrimeFaces. I'm sure many of you watching this presentation are familiar with PrimeFaces. And so PrimeFaces basically allows you to create the same type of pages you would do using a standard JSF front end. However, it uses its own custom components, which contain lots more functionality. So in this case, if I go to this Prime Index page, basically it's going to do the same thing with respect to the table. I'm using PrimeFaces data table instead though. So if you look here at the top, I'm getting this namespace and assigning it to the P prefix, primefaces.org UI. And so I can use P data table and I can call upon and get that same roster list. And something I really like about PrimeFaces is that their data tables are very powerful. You get sorting by default, you get, drag and drop those columns into the order you like them. Almost, an unlimited number of, functional options available for you in the data table. It is really a robust component. And one of those nice features that just is given to you is that instead of creating a facet for the header, I just passed header text. If you look back here at the way I had to create the initial table with JSF, I had to just use this column name. Every column had to have this facet for the header. I don't need that with the PrimeFaces. I just pass header text. Okay, same thing. So let me show you what this looks like. It looks a little bit nicer because there are some styling added to it. So this is Prime Index. It's not too much better, but there are a few things it gives you. As you can see, every other row is colored, shaded a little bit differently, so that it makes it a little easier on the eyes, okay? And basically, I've got the same functionality built out. But what I've done here with the ad, I've used this dialog instead, which provides you a nice pop-up and basically the same functionality here. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to add this, and you can see, voila, player is successfully added. It refreshes the screen nicely, and this is done in the code by just using this command button. All command buttons in PrimeFaces automatically use AJAX. So if you don't want to use AJAX, you can actually put the attribute AJAX equals false on those objects. But by using AJAX, I'm going to automatically not submit the page. It's just going to, it's not going to automatically refresh the page like it would do for a regular JSF component. It's just going to utilize action listeners. So in this case, what I'm doing though, with the add player button is I'm calling this manage dialog. I'm going to show it. So manage dialog is just a dialog component. And really all it does is it has this form inside of it. And as you saw in the add form I showed you earlier, it's just using a panel grid with labels, input text for getting that roster generated. And then I've got a couple of buttons here on the end. So the add player button basically is going to do the same thing. I'm going to call upon this method, which calls the RESTful web service, creates this form, and it will post it. And that's basically what I'm doing for that. If I wanted to update the player, I can also do that from within this view. So you can see I have this manage button. So let's say I want to manage that player. When I call upon that manage button, basically what that is doing, if I go back to the Prime Index, it is calling manage, the method manage in the roster controller and passing this current entity, okay? So all manage does is sets the current player equal to the player that you've selected, really. And then it goes ahead and it shows that manage form again. and that's populated with the current player. Okay, so now if I wanted to take this and say last name instead and update it, it's going to update that last name. The way that that is happening is via the JAX-RS again. So if I go back to the manage dialog and then I look at this update player, basically what I'm doing here is I'm calling upon the same web service. This time I am passing the ID again here, but instead of calling that delete, I'm calling put. So this will automatically call the web service method, which will edit or update that object. And what I'm doing here is I'm passing this entity, which is the current roster player, the current player in XML format. So let's look at that service that is being called. So this is going to call upon this here, okay? And it's going to check to see if the entity I'm passing has a player in it, if it's actually populated. If it's not, it's going to return a 400 response. Otherwise, it's going to edit that current object accordingly, and then it's going to return a response of okay, all right? So that is how the manage works. And remove is very similar. Like I had showed you before, basically I'm able to go ahead and let me get out of this manage dialog and go back to the prime index and show you the remove action. So in the roster controller, when I click remove, it's calling that same method, which is going to pass that current row entity to the web service and get rid of it. Okay, it's going to delete it. And the way I'm doing this nice confirmation dialog is I use the pconfirm method in here. And basically this widget allows me to add a header of confirmation, and it's going to ask if you're sure you wish to remove that player. And then if I go ahead and click yes, it's going to call upon that action listener. One more thing I need in my view in order to call this pconfirm is I need to have the confirm dialog. So this actually constructs the dialog that pops up when I click remove, okay? And so you can add as many command buttons as you'd like to it. I've got a yes and a no. When you click yes, then confirm it, then that action listener is invoked, and that person, then that record is removed from the database. So that's basically how my short little demo is going to work for you to call upon these web services and communicate with your JSF front end and your RESTful backend. Now, I want to mention and I want to stress that you should not leave your web services wide open. Really, this is just for demo purposes. What we really want to be doing here is each of these methods that can go ahead and change something, we want to be annotating this with some kind of a token. We want to require an authentication token in order to make this thing work. So basically what it's going to check is to verify that the person is authenticated into the database or into the application accordingly, and they have the correct roles before it will execute that RESTful web service call. I don't have the JWT set up for this basic application, but it is very easy to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So let's get back to the presentation here. First, I want to ask, does anybody have any questions out there? I haven't really looked at the chat, but but I'm not sure if anybody can actually ask any questions or not. But what I'll do is I'll go through the chat at the very end. That'll make it a little bit easier, and I'll put my picture on screen, so you're not just looking at my the chat window on my screen. So let's get back to the presentation here. So I showed you the communication demo, and like I said, when you're writing or modifying data, you want to utilize a web service that has annotation of put or post on it. And like I showed you with the add method, we are adding data, in this case using form parameters. So basically it will accept strings from your web form, and then it will create an entity and then call upon that entity manager to create that object and return a response. And then in this case here with the edit or the update or modify, however you'd like to call it, we have this method annotated with put, and I'm basically passing the ID of the entity, and what this is going to do is just check to make sure that this thing is populated, and then it's going to go ahead and edit it accordingly and return a response. And I showed you the demo for that already as well. And one thing that you can also do, which I've done for some of my applications, is you can utilize this @name stored procedure annotation on an entity class within the RESTful web service if you want to call upon a database stored procedure. Excuse me. So this is sometimes useful if you want to invoke some kind of a database functionality that would allow the database to go ahead and perform custom trigger or procedure that may populate a couple of different tables and return a response, and or maybe it even works with an underlying view somehow. Anyway, what you can do is you can actually hook up your JSF front end to invoke a action in your RESTful web service in the same manner, but call upon this name storage procedure, and it will invoke the database functionality that's in the procedure. So that is a useful thing to know about as well. Like I had mentioned, you're going to want to secure your services. This demo really didn't show any security. What we want to do is probably use something like OAuth or LDAP to require authentication into our application. So really what I do at work, or most of my projects, is I would have an LDAP backend, which is allowing access for directory services. And what I would do then is have someone log in that way and get a token, and then you can use that token into a cookie in your browser if you wanted to work with this JWT solution, or you can utilize something like the microprofile JWT solution, which will allow you to utilize annotations and whatnot to pass tokens around. Now, there's really a lot of different ways to go about it. Most of the applications I've written utilize a homegrown JSON web token implementation. And the reason is because I wrote a lot of this stuff JWT was around. I really would recommend looking at microprofile JSON web tokens if you wanted to secure your RESTful endpoints with something. It's really straight out of the box. As long as you're using OAuth or something similar, it allows you to easily secure your web services. And like I said, there's dozens of libraries out there all ready to go. So, if you've been a JSF developer for years and you want to start using this, it's easy to get going. If you've never used JSF, this is something to look at. I mean, thousands of components probably are available for your use now because JSF has been around for years. And these can all be used in the same way as I showed you today with the PrimeFaces front end. You can even hook up templates to make this thing reactive so that it will also scale to a mobile screen, just the same. And so PrimeFaces particular provides many different templates that allow, for a nice mobile screen as well as desktop. So in summary, it's easy to utilize microservices with JPA and JAX-RS to build database communication, and you can utilize these with front ends using JSF, CDI, and using a JAX-RS client to call upon those web services. Very easy also to utilize third-party libraries for limitless options. So I mentioned at the top that I am a member of a couple of different podcasts. I'm a member of the Pubhouse Podcast Network. I particularly do the Off-Heap podcast and Stacked podcast. So, you can always tune into those podcasts and listen in. We've always got new things to talk about each month. I also did want to take a quick moment and just dedicate this presentation today to those who have been victims of COVID-19. This is a pandemic that's it's plagued the world, and we're all suffering from it. But in my case, I'm very grateful to have the ability to work from home and be able to share, knowledge with you over the internet. We have so many resources available to us nowadays. We're very lucky to be able to do this in this day and age. I want to just dedicate this to the people who are sick and not doing well with COVID-19, and particularly those members of the Java community also. We did lose a member of the Java community earlier this month, and it really takes a toll on the community and it hits everybody hard. So I hope everybody stays safe and healthy out there. And if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to ask. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my screen sharing, and I'm going to go back onto my camera. So do ask questions if you have any. I apologize that the resolution was not very good in some cases there. Sorry about that. I did not show the system.out while I was doing my code. I was just trying to jump around a little too fast. Sorry about that. I apologize about the resolution.
All right, does anyone have any other questions? Any comments? We'll give people a few more seconds to write in the chat or in the ask a question section.
What I'll do is I'll post the presentation and the code so you can go ahead and grab it. I apologize that the resolution on the screen was not very good.
Oh, so we seem to have gotten a question. I saw you use the EJB as a REST component architecturally. Is that okay?
That's perfectly okay. And actually, I still utilize EJBs in lots of my single WAR file applications. EJBs are a perfectly viable option for utilizing nowadays. So yeah, I think architecturally that's okay.
All right, so if there's no more questions, I think we'll call that a day. Thank you so much, Josh, for presenting your presentation to us today. And you can find all the files and code that Josh presented on his social media. And thank you, everyone, for coming out. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh.